Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talking Wild. I am your host, Stefano Daza, and I'm so excited to have you here for episode 5 of our Zeyba podcast. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone who has been tuning in for our weekly discussions. If you want to support our podcast and all other Zeyba projects, head over to our website at zeybaapparel.com to shop your favorite Zeyba collections. I'm also very happy to announce that after much anticipation, we will be dropping our newest collection, Ecosystems, tomorrow. Ecosystems was an incredible collaborative project between us and some very talented artists, highlighting our changing world in a beautiful, creative, and extremely fashionable fashion. It was a long time in the making, and you can thank coronavirus for that, but the wait is finally over, and I promise that you will not be disappointed. All right. On today's episode, I'm joined by my very good friend, Damani Eubanks. Damani is a second-year PhD student at the University of Maryland. His current research focuses on using tree data and long-term forest monitoring plots to develop a quantitative definition for forest ecosystem health around the world. Damani and I both went to the University of Rochester, where we studied ecology and evolutionary biology. But aside from his love for nature, Damani is also very passionate about social justice and African American empowerment in the United States. We often discuss these things in college, and with the current Black Lives Matter protests happening around the country, we decided to discuss these issues and how they relate to the fields of science, research, and conservation. We have a fascinating conversation about the impact of race on the inception of the conservation movement and current misguided conservation practices utilized around the world that ignore local communities. We then dive deep into Black representation in the natural sciences and how to effectively recruit and support the next generation of conservationists. So without further ado, I bring you episode 5 of Talking Wild. Today on the podcast, I have one of my really good friends, one of my best friends, actually.
Nah, I don't know this guy.
Damani Eubanks. Damani, welcome to Talking Wild, bro.
Oh, thank you, man. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you, bro. You've helped me out with Zeyba a ton, so it was very natural for me to ask you to come on our podcast, and I'm glad you agreed.
Good to be here, man. I like what Zeyba's doing from the start. We were just kids in college, with big dreams.
Yeah. So Damani and I actually met in college. We both became friends because we both were recipients of the scholarship that got us to go to U of R, the Renaissance and Global Scholarship. And we were friends, from the beginning. And as it turned out, we both pursued the study of ecology and evolutionary bio. We both went to the Galapagos, but at different times. Damani went before me. It kind of sucked that we didn't link up.
Yeah, you stole my idea.
But we both have like a fascination with nature and conservation. But the reason why I have my friend on today is because he's also very into the field of race and environment. And with all the current Black Lives Matter protests going on and everything that's going on in the world right now, it was very natural for me to ask him to come on and share, his opinion, what he thought about the whole thing, and also the topic of race in conservation and racism in the fields of science. So we're about to have a really good conversation, dude, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Before we get started, you want to tell people kind of who you are, where you go to school, what you do currently?
Yeah, so just a quick introduction. Like he said, my name is Damani Eubanks, and I graduated from the University of Rochester with Stefano, and currently I am at the University of Maryland. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Swenson Ecology Lab, and our lab focuses on tropical trees and tropical tree ecology. And currently, my research is focused on using tree trait data and long-term forest monitoring plots to try and develop a quantitative definition for forest ecosystem health, which kind of in a more simple
That's
way
a
of
math word,
saying,
yeah. I was gonna say.
in a more simple way of saying, I'm interested in taking lots of data that we've collected over the years about different ecosystems in different forests, and using that data to try to determine how healthy an ecosystem is, and then possibly taking that data and using it to project into the future how we think different ecosystems are going to respond to climate change and human involvement and things like that.
And where have you been doing this research? Because I know you've been traveling around a little bit.
So some of my there's a lot of field work in what I do, and so I've been doing some field work here in the United States, in Maryland, and then also in Costa Rica, where we have a couple of forest plots set up. But I'm actually pulling data from forest plots set up all over the world. So there's a couple of global forest monitoring programs that measure data in forests all over the world. So it's a very kind of global project that I'm working on.
And before we dive into our main topic, what cool things have you been finding from your research? Like any cool trends or like concerning trends?
So right now, my research is kind of in the preliminary stages, but just the idea of developing a quantitative measure for forest health is actually kind of new in the field. So there's a lot of different definitions of forest health, like the different governments, the UN and things have developed what they think are good definitions of forest health, but none of them are actually measurable or kind of usable in a scientific space, at least not currently. And so my goal is to actually try and develop a definition that can be used and be measured all over the world, to kind of like see how ecosystems are doing and how they're responding to different stressors and things like that. So work has been done for years on just tracking different ecosystems, seeing how biodiverse they are and things like that. But I'm kind of trying to take all of that stuff that's already been done and kind of put it together into something new.
That's really cool, man. It's really important to monitor the health of our forests, especially with climate change changing pretty much every natural system that we know.
Yeah.
We have no clue how the natural world is going to react to anything. So that is really cool. All right, dude. So let's jump into the main thing that I want to cover today. The thing that's taking up every headline for the last week. Police brutality in the United States, police brutality against specifically African Americans. And on this show, we're all about nature, wildlife conservation, getting people excited about planet Earth. But it would be very irresponsible of us to, stay silent on this issue, especially when so many people, scientists and nature lovers are Black and are getting discriminated upon. We have a right to stand up for those people. So I want to get kind of your input about what the situation is, and if as a Black scientist, have you ever experienced any sort of racism or discrimination, or are you aware of any discrimination in the systems of science in schools and universities?
Yeah, so I mean, like you were saying, pretty much you'd have to live under a rock to not see what's been going on um, recently. Though it is not a new issue by any means, but
Right.
this is, you know, really been a galvanizing situation for the movement that's existed for a while. Um, so you can kind of trace, at least under the name Black Lives Matter, that movement to the mid 2010s, with the first, videotaped cases of police brutality hitting the internet, going viral, and things like that.
Hmm.
And then from then till now, you know, just repeated cases over and over and over again, of these videos coming out. And so, with this particular kind of explosion of protests in all 50 states, I think is
Right.
just kind of just a product of the frustration that people in the community have had for so long, and it's kind of now just garnering this level of national attention. But it's definitely, not a brand new thing by any means.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's not just police brutality, but racism in all sorts of different ways.
yeah,
And I think that, of course, like it was this particular killing was just so brutal, um, that got people upset. But it's the injustices that African Americans, or people of color face literally every day doing anything
yeah,
that
definitely.
people have been kind of really upset about.
Yeah. Yeah, the systematic racism, white supremacy, and oppression is kind of like a 360-degree thing. Like it's surrounding us at all times, no matter what your race is. It's
Exactly.
affecting, even the littlest things in our everyday lives. And so, as good as it is, for people to start acknowledging it at this large scale, it's not just about police brutality. It's not
Right.
even just about racism in America, because it's really a global problem, and a,
Right.
and ties into so many different parts of our lives. Uh,
So just like it applies so deeply to conservation from my experiences abroad. I know we talked about this a little. We've talked about this, in our casual friendships, but conservation, and this I might get some heat for saying this, but was born out of racism. Like the when Teddy Roosevelt first created Yellowstone National Park, the first national park in the world, he created it to protect it for future generations, right? So he said that this land was going to be off bounds to any human activity, etc. After quite literally like decades and decades of white Americans coming and decimating buffalo populations, exterminating all the wildlife and the vegetation that the Native Americans depended on. And then for a president to come in and say, okay, now this land is going to be protected, and the native tribes weren't allowed into national parks. It's just so like arrogant, and that model has been adopted by South Africa, where you see massive national parks in South Africa, uh, quite literally eliminating native peoples from that land, which they have always been there. And you could argue that there was not really a conservation problem until white people arrived. So um, yeah, that idea that conservation is very much was born out of racism, I've seen it, at least in South Africa. Um, what do you think?
Um, no, yeah, I definitely can agree with that to a certain like set of points. Um, like the example you gave for South Africa, I've also seen it in Costa Rica, where there are a number of indigenous groups of people who live very close to or even within some of the tropical rainforest habitats. And the design that Costa Rica has chosen in their conservation, which Costa Rica is considered like one of the most progressive countries in the world as
Right.
far as it goes
It's super,
with
yeah,
conservation.
super
But at
progressive.
the same time, um, the way that they've set up these parks as kind of like um, a a no touching zone, it has negatively affected the indigenous people to the point where some of them have even had to leave their native land and move somewhere else or try to move into cities or other communities where they're not really welcome. And then they are facing discrimination and racism in those areas on top of being forced out of where they've lived for generations. And it's kind of been a repeating story through that the idea of a no extraction, no touching conservation model, which even a lot of scientists today kind of dispute that idea of conservation that
Right.
for an area to be fully conserved means that there's no human presence because in modern times that's nearly impossible with climate change and pollution and other things like that. You pretty much cannot create a untouched, completely pristine ecosystem anymore. And
Right.
so a lot of environmental activists and some scientists are speaking more towards the idea that um, the a more logical and more humane form of conservation is finding a balance between human consumption and environmental degradation, and finding a way to balance that where the two can coexist, which you could even argue
Yeah.
that native people and indigenous people have been doing that with the land for their entire
For their
lifetimes.
entire lifetime. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of conservation, which is true of a lot of science in general, is that it does have a Western Eurocentric view on in its approach and on the
Mm,
way that it kind of is exacted in a lot of different places, and what might work in the United States or Europe might not work somewhere in the global South, and vice versa. Um,
right.
and
Well, I think that's something that you touched on. Um, is so accurate. Is 20th century and 19th century conservation models are very Western in that it's all about protecting the land and seeing those native populations as separate from that land. When in reality, like you said, they have been coexisting in a pretty successful balance, at least for centuries, maybe in some cases even millennia, for white people or Westerners to come in and completely ignore those native communities is missing the point, and in some cases is actually very detrimental to um, whatever ecosystem it is that they're trying to protect, because then the local communities will be like, well, screw this, like I can, this nature isn't helping me anymore, it has taken away from my way of life. They can actively take a negative view of it, or start taking from it to make some money. In the case, I've seen this in poaching in South Africa. If you don't include native communities in conservation efforts, you're going to get people who turn to poaching and bushmeat and gathering instead of protecting the wildlife, because they see no benefit to protecting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of at least my biggest critique of from what I've seen in the industry, in research science, especially in the global South, is that we've got these, these American and these European scientists, and a lot often now Chinese scientists coming down to South America, Africa, these more remote islands in Southeast Asia, and they're doing their research, taking their data, saying, oh, like we're helping this environment, we're saving this ecosystem, but at the same time they're still benefiting from it, they're extracting from it, and none of that funding that comes from the research, none of the credit and all of that goes to these local people, which often, these local people are serving as guides and field workers for the researchers, and being paid, pennies on the dollar compared to the researchers doing the work. And so even in like the idea that like, oh, we're trying to prevent people from exploiting the environment, like even that work is exploitive because you're taking away at times agency or control, or even just the control at all from the people who live there and actually have to deal with what's going on in their environment every day.
So have you thought about ways of improving these problems, of ways of giving local people more power in conservation efforts? How can people benefit from 21st century conservation from where they live?
So I've definitely thought about it, just in seeing the current methodologies of how things are working right now, and I actually got to see firsthand some positive efforts when I was in Costa Rica. I went to a conference held at the field station that I was working at, where the whole idea of the conference was to join together foreign university researchers and local park workers, environmental workers, and just the local community in general to talk about and share ideas, and for the locals to share the work and the research that they've been doing, and kind of educate the university professors and researchers who might not have even known that any of that stuff was going on. And so kind of drawing on that idea, I think it's just more engagement. So when you're a researcher going into a foreign country and you're doing your research, like you should be talking to the locals about your research, sharing.
Yeah. And this would seem like common sense, like it's kind of ridiculous that it hasn't been
but
working like
it's
this.
Also, it's sometimes hard. There's different things. There's a language barrier often, which I've always, kind of thought that if you're going to go out into a foreign country and do research, you should at least either have a translator or figure out, how to communicate, what you're doing while you're there. And so in some of the work that I was doing in Costa Rica, we had hired some local university students who were doing their own ecological research to help us out with ours. And we were paying them, and they were helping us out, showing us things that we didn't know, and we were kind of talking with them about some of the more advanced coding methods and data collection methods that we have access to. And I think it's just that exchange of information is the most important part, because if people know the importance of the work that you're doing, know the importance of conserving their environment, then they will be able to take up that work themselves, and then it would be less of a need for foreigners to come down and try to conserve or protect these ecosystems,
Right.
because the people are doing it themselves anyway, because they have that knowledge. And so I think it's just more investment, time, energy, and even money, because these science is expensive, and it's hard to
It
do.
is.
Um, and so that's why the research aspect of conservation in the global South is lagging behind, because of lack of investment. But these American universities have all this money to fund these research trips. I think researchers should be writing into their grants, money included for education and training for local people, um, because it would help the research as well. To have someone in the
Right.
field all the time, as opposed to going out for a couple of weeks or a couple of months a year. That's more information that can be gathered, more discoveries to be made, because you've got feet on the ground.
So this is a great transition point because I want to jump from like
Mm.
the field onto the lab and focus on actual researchers, scientists, specifically like Black scientists in
Mm.
conservation. So it is from my personal experience, from the programs that I've been in, from the Galapagos and Africa and everything. I've worked with very few Black conservationists. Has that been your experience too? Is this just like my personal, I've just been in really racist programs, or like is this something that people of color aren't naturally going into the fields of conservation or biology or nature biology?
Um,
Um,
so
what do
I
you
mean,
think?
in my own personal experience, I can't say that I have ever really run into another Black ecologist, or Black, field researcher. Um,
And why do you think that this is
I
the
mean,
case?
I think that there's a lot of factors into it. Um, the biggest being, a lack of representation in the scientific field in general. Like the NSF has a report um, on the ethnic divisions throughout the entire field of science and engineering. And currently, Black people only account for 6.8% of that total workforce in the
Oh my
United
God,
States, compared to, the 13 or 14% of the total population. And then in the
they
life
make up.
sciences specifically, it's even lower. It's 2.5% of all occupations in life science, that are occupied by Black people. And so, that lack of representation, on top of, just education. So I think that the way that people get into science, specifically research science, is by being exposed to that at a young age. That's definitely what got
Right.
me interested in research and conservation, was being 7 or 8 years old and learning about the Amazon rainforest, and being just enthralled by it. And like, you know I grew up right outside of Washington D.C., so I went to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, and walking through the museum and seeing like all of these animals that they have there, kind of started to inspire me. But not everybody, especially not Black people, are given the chance to engage in science in that way, and to build up an interest in it, for a number of different reasons. So, the way that school works for your average Black person in the United States, and the way that opportunities and jobs are presented to young Black people is usually like, you need to go to school and find a job that's going to make you a lot of money. You have to go out and you have to make a lot of money.
Yes.
And, ecology and conservation is not a big money field.
Not those,
It's
not that
just
kind
not a
of a
big money
job.
field. And so even educated and successful Black people don't often find a lot of openings in research science because of that idea. So like I've seen and met many Black doctors, or Black computer engineers, scientific fields that still are underrepresented, but at least growing up, those were considered very good jobs that you would aspire to.
Right.
Yeah.
Income
And
wise.
so it had less to do with your pure interest in whatever scientific field, and a little bit more to do with, that idea that you need to find a good job and make, good money if you were going to go to college and do all of that.
So you think that it's not so much a systematic racism issue in the fields of like science that are causing a misrepresentation of like African Americans in these fields? You think it's more of a like cultural issue in that it's not seen as a money generator, or that there is not a lot of influence for young Black people to go into this field because they don't see themselves represented in those fields?
It's not to say that systematic racism and oppression is not a factor, because it's a factor in every job field in terms of being offered opportunities and getting the access to be successful in these fields. But
Right.
academia is usually considered more progressive than other job
Right.
fields. Not to say that it's perfect, or that it's outside of the racial systems of oppression, but I think it's a combination of outside pressures in the forms of racism, and then kind of more internal pressures in the form of you get inspired to do something often by seeing someone who looks like you doing it, and so you have a lot more
Correct.
examples of a Black doctor. You have a lot more examples of a Black engineer than you do for Black research scientists, and so that's on me and other people in the field to go and put ourselves out there and engage in the community so that they can see us. But
Right. So how, this is obviously the natural follow-up question. How do we inspire the next generation of conservationists, specifically those who are people of color, to join these fields at such a time when like climate change is bearing down on us, habitat loss is, destroying habitats all over the world? How do we inspire more African American colored people to join these very important critical fights?
So I've always believed that education and outreach is the best way to engage marginalized communities in the sciences. I've been kind of passionate about that for a long time, and even in high school and through college, I spent a lot of time in local schools, in the DC area, and also in Rochester, dealing with mostly African American kids, doing science experiments, you know, engaging with the kids, talking to them about what I do, um, and trying
Mm-hmm.
to present science as something that's fun, and accessible for them. And so I think that the entire scientific community also needs to kind of jump on that as well, because you know, you meet your average scientist, your average researcher, they don't even like teaching undergraduates. They would rather, you know, focus only on their research, you know, put out as many papers as you can, research. But I mean, I personally believe that there's bigger things than that. You know, it's important to do your research,
Right.
and to try to, you know, make these discoveries, but you also are responsible for passing on the information and everything that you've learned to the next generation. And, you know, in terms of getting to see that kind of stuff up front, uh, African Americans and other people of color just have less of an opportunity than white kids. And so it's on us, the scientists and the scientific community and the conservation community, to go out um, and to do it, to talk to these kids, to engage them,
Yeah.
to show them that what you do is cool, and that it's important.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think this is like perfect time to share a little story. When I was so earlier this year, I wanted Zeyba to have a more direct impact in the local community here in Rochester, and I actually reached out to you and I asked you, you know, how can my brand help and support community members who want to make a difference? And you said, uh, give them money, give them like grants to actually install projects that they're passionate about that can cause positive change in the community. And I thought that that was such a brilliant idea that, you know, we created Zeyba grants. And unfortunately, with coronavirus, we haven't really been able to scale up the program right now. But hopefully, you know, in a couple of months, we're going to be able to give out grants to people all over the community to start their own projects. And here in Rochester, that has, you know, such a large African American community, I want to see a lot of those Zeba grants going to these young African American kids. And in a way, I believe that this is how you inspire the youth: is, you know, you give them the resources, you give them the support, you show them that it's cool, that they can actually make a change in the community, you invest in them, and that's at least, you know, how I think we can make a change. And you were very much the reason of why we started that. So I just want to say thank you again for helping me come
I
up with
mean,
that
yeah, no, you're
program.
definitely right. And it's like, it doesn't even, when I say invest, it doesn't need to be, you know, goo gobs of money. It doesn't need to be lots of money. Like when I was in high school, I received a grant for $1,000 to run a youth STEM education program. And just with that $1,000, I was able to go into 5 different schools and teach lessons for 6 months.
Wow.
And then I was able to hold like a STEM education fair that had over 300 kids at it. And I got, you know, speakers
Wow.
from NASA and from the Smithsonian and a bunch of other people to jump
No
onto
way.
this. And I don't even think we spent
That's awesome,
all
dude.
$1,000. Like I was
Right.
able to do that just by, you know, calling and emailing a bunch of people to get them to donate their time for free. Because the one thing I will say about the scientific community is that even when there are sometimes, you know, shortcomings in our outreach towards Black people, minorities, when given the opportunity, I would say that most scientists and most researchers are going to come out and step up and help. Um, and so it's just a matter
Mm-hmm.
of organizing all of that to make it work. And so, you know, it just means that more people need to be proactive and get out there and do the organizing, because there are resources and people who are willing to help.
Do you think people are starting to realize this? Do you think that specific like funds or scholarships are being made available to minority groups in the sciences? And how do we encourage universities and scientific institutions to create these opportunities for underrepresented
There's
minorities?
definitely some resources already out there that exist, different scholarships and grants that are aimed at minority communities, like Black, Hispanic, Asian American, and then also, yeah, women.
Women.
There's been actually, I've been the one thing that I've noticed that's been very positive in my time involved in the science community is the growth of the involvement of women scientists. And so even in my lab, there's 8 grad students and 6 of them are women. And when I'm out in the
Wow.
field, I see a lot more women than, when you look back at like old videos and movies from like National Geographic or Discovery Planet, stuff like that, where it's just like a bunch of
Right.
white men.
It's all
I'm
white
seeing a
men.
lot more engagement from women, especially women of color, and there's a lot of programs and stuff pushing for that, and I think it's working. So I think we just need to take that and do the same kind of idea and to keep the ball rolling so that it can include, other people, other marginalized groups, specifically people of color. And so, I mean,
Right.
there are some resources out there, but in comparison to, the level that white people, especially white males, are getting, there can always be more.
Exactly. And if anything positive comes out of the current protests, at least in the fields of science, is that more resources will be made available for African Americans and other underrepresented groups in the sciences. Because, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, the problems that we face right now on our planet are so big
Yeah.
that we need everybody on board helping fight for it. We need a diverse coalition with diverse
Mm-hmm.
ideas to address all these issues. And if we're excluding, a whole race or, there's only a few representatives, that's just not going to get the job done. And, we just can't be like that. So I hope that out of this, you know, at least more funds, which, that's the way that I think is the best way to support people, is putting your money where your mouth is, and like actually giving people the
Yeah.
resources to do something. And like you said, it doesn't have to be much. Like $1,000 can go a long way, can actually change a person's way of thinking and inspire them. So these micro investments in people can really ignite like a revolution in the sciences, and I hope
Yeah, definitely,
that
I
does
agree.
come about. All right, well, Damani, do you have any last thoughts or closing statements that you want to make to anybody listening who is an aspiring biologist, ecologist, conservationist that's looking to get involved in the kind of research that you want to do? Do you have any last thoughts for them?
I think that scientific research, at least in today's society and today's economy, definitely has kind of a little bit of an air of altruism about it. It's not the biggest money field. It's not you're not going to become famous more often than not. But there is it's a bigger picture that we are trying to look at when we do this type of research. And so for me personally, the picture that I would like to see, the picture that I'm trying to paint, is a world where where we can look at both our society and the environment and see that no people are more marginalized or more damaged by what's going on than any other. And that's especially true when we're talking about the environment and racism, because when you look at the global South, when you look at even parts of the United States, areas most affected by hurricanes, areas most affected by pollution, areas most affected by deforestation, all of that is people of color are bearing the brunt of all of that. And so, no matter what race you are, we're all living on this earth right now, and there's a problem with how we are using our resources and using the earth's resources. We're over exploiting them, and then they're also not distributed evenly. And I believe that, with some shifts in our culture, we can both distribute evenly all the bountiful resources that the earth has there for us, and also use them responsibly and sustainably. And so that's kind of the vision that keeps me going when I'm doing my research. And, if you're interested in research, if you're interested in conservation or social justice or anything like that, you just have to build your vision of what you want the world to look like, for the next generation and for the generations coming on. And go out there and try to build it. Don't let anybody tell you can't do it. Don't let anybody stop you, and work hard.
Awesome, dude. You have to become the leader that you want to see. And just the last thing that I thought about as you were saying is, climate change is going to disproportionately affect minority groups and like African Americans, Latinos, more than other groups. So if you, like you said, if you want to do some social justice work, environmentalism is like one of the best things that you can go into to make sure that your community has good drinking water, has clean air, has plenty of nature around it, and natural services, because it's going to be these groups that are going to suffer the most.
Absolutely.
In the future. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on, dude. It's been an absolute blast. Thanks again for helping me come up with Zeyba grants. I can't wait to start getting those going. You're the man.
Thank you
dude.
for having me, man.
You're an inspiration.
I'm really proud of what you've been doing to see Zeyba grow. From you and your first box of T-shirts a couple of years ago.
Yeah, a long time. We have a new collection coming out next week on Tuesday, so
nice.
Stay tuned.
You better send me a shirt.
Can't wait. I'll think about it.
All right, man. Yeah.
All right, man. Take it easy.
Peace.
Thanks for coming on. Join us on future episodes of Talking Wild every Monday as we have more fascinating guests join us to talk about everything nature, wildlife, and conservation. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by liking and sharing. And if you'd like to support Zeyba, head over to our website at zeybaapparel.com to shop your favorite Zeyba merch. Thank you for joining us, and remember to stay wild.